I was 52 when a storm tore my life open. Not the kind that rattles windows or floods the streets, but the kind that moves quietly through a house and leaves everything crooked, unrecognizable. At 5 a.m., with the night rain still clinging to my jacket, I walked through the sliding doors of St. Mary's Medical Center, just outside Washington, D.C. The lobby was empty except for a security guard half asleep at his desk and the hum of machines warming the air with their indifference. My phone vibrated again in my pocket. Messages I hadn't gathered the courage to open. The last one I had read was from a night shift nurse. "Your daughter is in the ICU. You need to come immediately." No explanation. No preamble. Just that. The elevator felt too slow, its soft whine like a taunt. So I took the stairs, climbing them 2 at a time, my breath shallow, my pulse uneven. Every step sounded like a verdict. I had tried to prepare myself for whatever I might find. But preparation is a luxury reserved for calmer lives. Fathers don't prepare for scenes that steal their breath. Grace had always been the steady light in any room. A youth counselor, the one who broke tension with gentleness, the woman who made strangers feel seen. I used to watch her help people the way some people watch sunsets. Aware that something rare was happening, grateful just to witness it. Now that same light had collapsed somewhere behind a closed ICU door. When I entered the room, the air felt colder than it should have. The fluorescent lights washed every surface pale, including the small figure lying in the bed. My daughter's skin had turned a color I had only seen once before, on my mother's face the morning I found her after her stroke. A gray that didn't belong on the living. Wires traced over her like a crude web, each monitor marking a rhythm her own body no longer trusted. Her chest rose mechanically, a fragile, borrowed motion. Machines breathed for her the way I had breathed for her when she was a newborn. A doctor walked in shortly after I arrived. A tired man with the expression of someone who carries too many families' grief inside his coat pockets. He spoke in a low, steady cadence. Seizures, kidney distress, neurological complications. Nothing ruled out. Nothing confirmed. They were trying everything. They didn't know what they were fighting yet. When he spoke the words "no clear cause," something cold settled behind my ribs. Illness follows patterns. Accidents leave clues. But no clear cause felt different. It carried the faint outline of something intentional. I asked about Andrew. I asked because I had assumed, even through fear, that her husband would be folded in the corner chair or pacing the hallway. Instead, the doctor told me Andrew had signed the admission paperwork, spoken briefly with staff and left, claiming an urgent corporate engagement. Corporate engagement. While his wife lay under hospital lights, drifting somewhere between silence and oblivion. Silence filled the room after that. The monitors kept their steady ticking, untouched by the weight crushing my chest. I pulled a chair beside her bed and sat slowly, lowering myself the way one does in places where grief makes the floor feel unstable. When I finally reached for her hand, it felt too cold, too still, like her spirit had retreated deep inside, hiding from something she couldn't fight alone. I studied her face, the faint bruising near her temples, the dryness around her lips, the tiny tremors in her fingers. These weren't the traces of a sudden collapse. These were signs of a body forced down step by steady step. And in that moment, in the quiet hum of machines and rain still clinging to my shoes, I realized this wasn't just an illness that had taken root in her. Something else had been pressing her toward this edge long before tonight. Something deliberate. When I lifted my hand from hers, I felt a tremor run through me. A stillness that didn't belong to age or exhaustion. It was recognition, the first quiet acknowledgement that someone had guided my daughter toward death, one subtle cruelty at a time. And whoever had done it believed no one would notice. But I noticed. I felt it the moment I walked into that room. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the last year in my mind, tracing every faint signal I had ignored. It's strange how a crisis sharpens old memories, how details you once brushed aside return with a different color. Darker, heavier, more honest. Grace had been tired for months. Not the tired that comes from overwork or late nights, but the kind that sits deep in the bones, stealing the brightness from her voice 1 inch at a time. She would smile on the phone, but it wasn't the kind that warmed a room. It was thin, practiced. A smile built to reassure me rather than reflect the truth. She had mentioned nausea once, headaches another time, then dizziness, then sudden bouts of exhaustion. Andrew always explained it away before I had the chance to ask questions. Stress from her counseling work. Too many emotionally heavy cases. Hormonal shifts. Changing seasons. Too little sleep. Too much sleep. He always had a diagnosis ready, polished, and reasonable. I wanted to believe him. Sometimes fathers want so badly to trust the people our children choose that we ignore the quiet signals in our own gut. Andrew insisted he was managing everything. The finances, the travel, the home repairs, the business dinners, the entire architecture of their life. He said it like he was offering her a gift, taking burdens off her shoulders. And Grace, who always tried to avoid conflict, let him. She said it eased her mind to have someone so efficient, so decisive, handling the details. Except the details began to erase her. She started missing our Sunday calls, the ones she never skipped before marriage. She canceled lunches we had already planned. Family dinners were postponed, then forgotten entirely. Messages went unanswered for hours, then days. Each absence came with a thoughtful explanation. A meeting had run long. A migraine had flared up. Andrew needed her presence at a client event. All of it reasonable. All of it quiet. All of it adding up to something I didn't yet want to see. I watched her world grow smaller, not through conflict, but through courtesy. A subtle reshaping of her time. A polite redirection of her attention. A slow, almost graceful disappearance of access. Andrew had a way of speaking that made concern seem intrusive, as if asking questions meant undermining his ability to care for her. He was always composed, always articulate. The kind of man people describe as put together. The kind who looks you in the eye just long enough to seem sincere while revealing nothing of himself. Neighbors loved him. Friends admired him. Even I, in the early days, respected the discipline in his voice and the way he could make a room lean in without raising it. But there was an emptiness in him too, a hollow efficiency, like he was performing the role of a husband rather than living it. And Grace, she tried to adapt. She dressed the part of a woman whose life was under control, even when the exhaustion showed through her foundation. She kept assuring me things were fine, even when her sentences began to shrink, as though each word took too much energy to form. Looking back, I realize I mistook distance for adulthood, silence for stability, and isolation for independence. I believed she was simply navigating the rhythms of marriage, that all families adjust, that freedom sometimes changes shape after vows are spoken. But the truth was simpler, colder. I was being edged out, slowly, carefully, and with the kind of precision that hides itself behind courtesy. I should have seen it sooner. I should have recognized the patterns I had once seen in clients, in colleagues, in those manipulative personalities who operate politely while taking apart someone's support system piece by piece. Instead, I tried to be understanding. I convinced myself she was building her own life, her own family, and that my role was to stand quietly at the edges and let her grow. But standing at the edges comes with a consequence. You don't always see what's happening at the center until the structure is already collapsing. And by the time I understood how isolated she'd become, she was already lying unconscious under fluorescent lights, drifting on a thin line between breath and oblivion. It wasn't stress that had hollowed her out. It wasn't migraines. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't adulthood. It was something methodical, something intentional, something that had been happening in front of me the entire time. Only now, sitting in the half-dark ICU room with her cold hand in mine, did I realize how far she had been pulled away, and how carefully Andrew had drawn the curtains behind her. The human mind has a way of protecting itself, even in the face of suspicion. It prefers the familiar lie over the uncomfortable truth. For weeks I had sat beside Grace's hospital bed, listening to the hum of machines and replaying old conversations in my head. All those moments when she'd hesitated before saying, "I'm fine, Dad," her voice thinning like fabric worn too many times. Still, a part of me wanted to believe Andrew was simply overwhelmed, misguided perhaps, but not dangerous. Fathers cling to hope longer than reason should allow. That hope dissolved the morning Carl called. Carl was a retired sergeant I volunteered with at a community center. A good man, slow to speak, slower to judge. He was not the type to exaggerate or meddle. So when he asked if I could step outside the ICU for a moment, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, I knew something had shifted. I met him near the vending machines, the kind of sterile corner that always smells faintly of coffee nobody wants. He held his phone in both hands, as if anchoring himself. "Thought you should see this," he said quietly. It was a photograph, Andrew in a midnight blue tuxedo, standing beneath strings of white lights on a Baltimore rooftop. His posture was relaxed, confident, one hand resting on the waist of a woman I had never seen before. She was young, with a knowing smile and the kind of casual intimacy that doesn't form overnight. The timestamp at the bottom was unmistakable. Hours after Grace was admitted to the ICU. I felt something slow and cold move through me, like a tide pulling away from shore. Carl swiped again. Another photograph. And another. Andrew laughing, champagne in hand. Andrew leaning in to whisper something in the woman's ear. Andrew posing for a fundraiser backdrop, jaw set in that polished way he used when he needed the world to admire him. There were no signs of urgency or grief. No evidence of the man I had expected to be sitting beside my daughter's bed. "This was last night," Carl said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Found it on a public events page for the gala." He was listed as a sponsor. A sponsor. The word felt like a bruise. I studied the images again, slower this time, letting each detail settle in the space inside me where denial had been trying to make a home. Andrew hadn't rushed to a meeting. He hadn't been burdened by responsibility. He hadn't been overwhelmed. He had been celebrating. And that celebration led me to do something I had been avoiding, a deeper look into the things Grace never spoke about. When I returned to the ICU room, I opened her medical folder. I read the toxicology report fully, line by line, letting the clinical language reveal what Grace no longer could. Ethylene glycol. Not in a single dose but through repeated exposure, disguised symptoms, gradual organ failure, a quiet descent masquerading as stress. Ethylene glycol is antifreeze. Antifreeze doesn't slip into someone's system by accident. It is administered, measured, sustained. I closed the folder with a slow, deliberate motion, the way one closes the last page of a book that no longer leaves room for interpretation. Then I remembered something else. The insurance documents Andrew had politely brushed off whenever I tried to ask about finances. I asked hospital administration for copies of the records he had submitted upon admission. There, in cold print, sat the confirmation that sealed everything. Andrew had increased Grace's life insurance from $150,000 to $4.2 million. 60 days ago. I sat back, my hands resting heavily in my lap. The machines beside Grace kept their indifferent rhythm, unaware of the hollow quiet settling over me. I looked at her face, pale, steady, unchanged, and I realized she had been trying to tell me something for months. Not through words, but through exhaustion, through disappearing calls, through the way her smile dimmed as Andrew's control grew. All those small signals had formed a pattern I refused to see. Until now, this wasn't an illness spiraling out of control. It was a plan, a timeline, a calculation drawn up with precision and carried out in silence. I felt no anger in that moment, just an immense, sorrowful clarity, as if the truth had always been there, waiting for me to stop hoping and start seeing. The man my daughter trusted had turned her life into a ledger, her pain into opportunity, her very breath into a potential payout. And while she lay unconscious in a dim hospital room, he stood under rooftop lights, smiling with a woman who had no trace of worry in her eyes. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not rage, not vengeance, but a stillness I recognized from years of difficult decisions. A quiet resolve, measured, patient. The truth was undeniable now, and once truth reveals itself fully, it cannot be put back in the dark. I didn't confront Andrew. Not then. Not in the hospital hallway. Not through a phone call. Not with the kind of rage people expect from a father whose daughter has been dragged to the edge of death. Rage is loud, and loud things alert predators. Silence, on the other hand, unsettles them. I spent that night in the dark corner of Grace's ICU room, listening to the machines breathe for her, while the pieces fell into place. When the sun rose, pale and thin through the hospital blinds, I made a decision, not driven by emotion, but by something colder and older inside me. A sense honed over years of navigating contracts, negotiations, and the sort of quiet traps people set for one another when money is involved. Andrew had orchestrated this slowly, carefully. He believed the world was a stage and that everyone around him, doctors, neighbors, colleagues, even me, would accept the role he assigned them. He counted on charm, on confusion, on the false authority of a man who appears in control. What he did not count on was scrutiny. I began where men like Andrew never imagine anyone will look. The paperwork. Grace's insurance files, amended 60 days ago. Medical reports from her last 3 urgent care visits. Financial statements tied to their joint accounts. Bank transfers from Andrew's business to a private international holding company. Corporate filings for a merger he had referenced too many times with rehearsed confidence. Every document held a fragment of a pattern, loose threads waiting for someone patient enough to pull. I preserved everything. Screenshots, downloads, printed copies, photographs with timestamps. I placed each piece carefully into a binder I bought from the hospital gift shop, its soft blue cover painfully cheerful for what it now contained. Then I reached out to a legal contact, a former colleague who transitioned into corporate compliance work. A woman who had no patience for charm, who once told me that fraud reveals itself the way rot does. First quietly, then everywhere at once. She reviewed the files for 3 hours. When she called me back, she didn't waste time on sympathy. His merger isn't real, she said. He fabricated the entire thing. Shell contracts, forged signatures, promised investors that revenue would reflect by the end of this quarter. It won't. He's underwater. Her voice tightened. And the life insurance increase? It'll raise every red flag in the system now that your daughter is hospitalized. You need to move quickly. I remember sitting in the small consultation room outside the ICU, staring at the phone long after she hung up, feeling the weight of the inevitable settle over me. Not panic, not shock, just an understanding that Andrew had built his life like a house of cards, and Grace had been placed quietly at the foundation. From there, I moved inward toward their assets. I contacted Grace's bank. I froze transactions tied to her personal accounts. I requested immediate holds due to medical incapacitation. The representative on the line hesitated at first, but legal documentation speaks louder than emotion ever could. With the right forms and the right language, her funds were protected before Andrew even realized he was losing access. Next, I notified hospital security. I didn't make accusations or dramatize anything. I simply handed them a packet of documents, each page clipped neatly beneath the next. They read in silence. Within an hour, Andrew's access to the ICU wing was restricted pending investigation. By sunset, I had spoken with a detective, a man who carried the weary patience of someone who has seen too many crimes committed not with violence, but with confidence. I handed him the binder. He read the insurance amendments twice. Then he looked up with a stillness I recognized. "We'll move on this," he said quietly. "But you'll need to stay quiet for now. He'll run if he senses anything." "I know," I replied. And I did know. Men like Andrew don't fight when confronted, they flee. They vanish into new identities, new countries, new stories they craft like well-tailored suits. So I didn't call him. I didn't text. I didn't approach his townhouse. I didn't alert his colleagues or post warnings or demand explanations. Silence was the one thing he could not interpret, the one variable he could not calculate. I sat beside my daughter in the dim hospital room, her hand resting motionless in mine, and I waited. Not with anger, not with desperation, with the kind of patience that feels like iron settling in the blood. Andrew believed he had orchestrated a perfect exit, that he would sign a few forms, disappear behind a gala's laughter, and return only when it was time to collect what remained of my daughter's life. He had no idea that the ground beneath him had already shifted, that every path he counted on was quietly closing. One document at a time, One timestamp at a time. One quiet, deliberate step at a time. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives on quiet feet, carrying a binder of evidence and a father who refuses to let his daughter die unseen. Andrew returned to the hospital the following evening wearing the same confidence he carried into every room. I saw him before he saw me. His polished stride, his tailored coat, the faint smirk of a man expecting sympathy, perhaps even admiration for his strength during a family crisis. Predators often mistake silence for weakness. He walked straight into the trap built from his own arrogance. Hospital security intercepted him before he reached the ICU doors. Their tone was professional, almost courteous, but firm. I stayed seated in the corner, hands folded in my lap, letting the scene unfold without inserting myself into it. They guided him gently, too gently for what he deserved, toward a reserved conference room where detectives waited behind a closed door. Andrew saw me as he passed. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, then confusion, then something that resembled concern but didn't reach his eyes. "Richard," he said, attempting to step toward me. "I." A security officer lifted a hand. "This way, sir." Andrew straightened, offended but controlled. Men like him rely on posture the way others rely on truth. He followed them down the hallway, unaware of what waited on the table. Printed screenshots of his gala photographs, insurance amendments bearing his signature, travel records, fraudulent contracts, timestamps he thought were invisible. I remained where I was. I didn't need to be in that room. My role wasn't to confront him. My role was to ensure the truth reached the right ears. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The machines in the ICU kept their quiet metronome, steady, indifferent. Life and law moved at different speeds, but both, in their own way, were deliberate. An hour passed, then another. Eventually, the conference room door opened. Andrew emerged with a different face. Drained, stiff, stripped of that effortless charm he used like currency. A detective walked on each side of him, their voices low but resolute. I caught only fragments. Toxicology report. Financial motive. Purchase receipts. International relocation. Life insurance fraud. Andrew didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't protest innocence in that frantic, breathless way guilty men often do. Instead, he froze, still, rigid, eyes losing focus as the walls of his own design folded around him. His suitcase was found in his car, his passport in his coat pocket, a one-way plane ticket to Mexico printed and tucked neatly beside it. Every detail aligned with quiet, devastating precision. Outside the conference room, under the sterile glow of hospital lights, the two detectives placed him in handcuffs. The faint metallic snap echoed down the hallway, sharp enough that a nurse paused mid-step. Andrew turned his head slightly, searching the hallway, perhaps expecting a confrontation, a plea, a scene worthy of the chaos he had created. I offered none. I simply watched him the way a man watches a storm pass, with calm acknowledgement, without fear, without triumph. When they led him away, his eyes finally met mine. Something flickered there. Disbelief, maybe, or the dawning realization that I had never once raised my voice, never accused him, never tipped my hand. He had underestimated silence, mistaking it for inaction. The police walked him through the automatic doors and out into the night. The glass closed behind them, reflecting a quiet corridor where no one applauded, no one shouted, no one demanded closure. Some victories make no noise at all. I returned to Grace's bedside. She was still sleeping, still fighting, still suspended in that uncertain space between injury and recovery. I took her hand again, warmer now, less fragile. The weight inside my chest eased just slightly. Grace survived. Not by miracle, but by endurance, by the stubborn persistence written into her bones since childhood. When she eventually woke, her first words were small and halting, but her eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen in years. She moved into a modest rental near the Potomac, somewhere quiet, somewhere she could rebuild without anyone mapping her steps. She returned to counseling slowly, one morning at a time. She laughed again, softer than before, but real. Healing doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates. It breathes itself back into the world inch by inch. Andrew faced charges. Attempted murder, insurance fraud, international flight intent, corporate manipulation. His name left conversations the moment his handcuffs clicked shut. His company collapsed within days. His mistress, Chloe, surrendered every message, every plan, every encrypted chat. Loyalty, it turned out, wasn't her strong suit once consequences stepped into the room. Justice didn't feel loud, not triumphant, not cleansing, felt warm. A slow sunrise after a long, sleepless night. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't dwell on revenge. I simply refused to let my daughter slip into darkness without someone pulling her back. Sometimes strength isn't sharp or fierce. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a father sitting beside a hospital bed, gathering truth piece by piece, patient enough to let justice find its way.